Alright, hello. This is XP Scaling, and today we will be covering part 2 of Ohma's overall strength and skill. Today we will be covering his overall techniques and skill that has been overlooked. And if you guys enjoy, please see my previous video in order to get a good understanding of his strength, speed, and durability. So without any further ado, let's begin. So now covering Ohma's skill and techniques. Now in order to cover Ohma's skill, we're gonna have to go over his techniques. So first of all, let's essentially go over his Niko style. So overall, the Niko style is mainly broken up into 4 parts. First off, we have the Redirection kata, which is, much like the name suggests, allows the user to redirect and control the flow of an opponent's strength and power. Secondly would be the water kata, which being grappling based and has a very strong leaning on flexibility and fluid movements. The Adamantine kata works on hardening the body for defensive purposes, as well as hardening the body for increasing the offensive abilities of an opponent, such as vastly increasing their overall striking power. And finally would be the flame kata, which allows the user to increase their movement speed and overall speed and agility. So now, Ohma himself has been using this style for at least 10 years, and more than likely over that, and knows technically every kata. So based off of that, let's cover each respective technique for each respective kata. First off, we have the Redirection kata. This, along with the flame kata, is what Ohma had been essentially most proficient with, and the 2 forms that he had mainly specialized and formed and based his fighting style mainly on these 2, though this would be before he had regained his memories. So overall, the Redirection kata allows Ohma to control the flow of his opponent's strength, but some various techniques involves, such as the Weeping Willow, involves Ohma allowing himself to parry his opponent's strikes. Another redirection technique would be the Redirection entanglement, which seems to entangle the flow of strength into an opponent's arm, essentially binding their muscles and their arms together. Another high-level parrying technique from the Redirection kata would be Flowing Edge, a parrying technique that seems to parry high-speed attacks. But the Redirection kata is not without any offensive capabilities either, as in combination with the water kata, they form the Swimming Willow technique, which is a series of strikes that form around the opponent's flow of strength. Another technique that has been shown would be Weeping Willow, which seems to be a grappling-based technique that can be used similarly to a shoulder throw, as well as the fact that Weeping Willow can be used evasively, as Ohma was able to essentially use this technique to evade a very up-close and personal attack. But now let's get onto the Redirection kata's 2 ultimate techniques. First off, it would be the Chi blockage technique, which Ohma had used to apparently cure Kiryu of the negative effects of the fallen demon. And finally would be the, if I can pronounce this, the Marionette, which allows Ohma to essentially move with the most minimal amounts of strength needed in order to save and conserve stamina. Now that we've covered the Redirection kata, let's move on to the Flame kata, as some of the moves that can be used in tandem with the Redirection kata would be Flickering Flame, a technique that allows for high speed and evasive movements while in the midst of combat. Essentially, it allows the user to essentially adjust their center of gravity while moving at high speeds. Alright, now up next would be the water katas, which, like mentioned before, should be based off grappling techniques and allows for good, lean flexibility and fluid movements that Ohma should have mastered now. First off, one of the very first techniques that we see would be Bind of Perses, which is similar to an armbar except that it aims at an opponent and is meant to be used while they are standing. Another technique would be Seagrass, which based on how it's used seems to be a technique that allows the user to take hold of an opponent so that they may strike them back properly with a counter. A striking based technique would be the water kata used in tandem with the redirection kata, as I managed to mention before, to form Swimming Willow, which is a technique that allows the user to have rapid strikes and allows them to attack outside of the opponent's range of power. A vicious chokehold would be Gluttony, which is used to choke out the combatant from behind. Another technique, which would be a ground-based technique, would be Screw Cutter, a technique allowing the user to bind their opponent to the floor. Another offensive technique would be Ironbreaker Revolution, which I would say is similar to a hammer strike used in karate, as it seems to use the base of the fist in order to strike down heavily. Now, another vicious chokehold would be Dragon's Vein. This is a technique which is meant to pin down both the opponent's neck and legs, and with his knees forces pressure onto the spine, though this technique is deadly and technically isn't one meant for combat. Another technique would also be the Jellyfish Hold, a technique in which you slip into the opponent's, I believe, blind spot and manage to choke them out with a reverse hold. And finally, we got onto the ultimate techniques of the water kata. The most important technique that we see is Mirror of Water. And Mirror of Water is essentially the move. It is technically grappling based, obviously, but it allows you to choke your opponent with potentially their own limb, that being either potentially their own arm or leg. And it's technically a form that doesn't really have it's technically a technique that doesn't have a form, meaning that it's meant to be unpredictable. And the final technique that we do see, but we don't get to see how it's used, is the Flamin' Water Kata Fire Water. Now, based on how we don't get to see it, it could potentially be a ground-based grappling move, or another evasive ground-based grappling move, but sadly Ohma didn't get to, show us what it does. Next up will be the Adamantine kata, which again is used for hardening the body for offensive and defensive purposes. First off, the most basic technique used in the Adamantine katas are the Indestructible. The Indestructible has both, again, offensive and defensive capabilities. Essentially, the function of the Indestructible is to tighten and harden your muscles, to essentially grant higher forms of durability against most forms of blunt force or even slashing trauma. So the Indestructible, when used defensively, also allows the user to drastically improve their stamina overall, whether it be their physical stamina or the stamina of their muscle condition. Now, the increase of one's physical durability, it can be argued, from what I've seen, to at least be a 5 times boost, as upon using the Indestructible against, essentially when Ohma used the Indestructible against Wakatoski, he stated that Wakatoski's strikes were essentially like a 50 in comparison to his own defense. Now, I am gonna say this, It should be noted that Ohma had just started to remember many of his lost techniques, and he had essentially regained mastery of the Adamantine katas. And he had just regained all the memories and his lost skill, and had taken a considerable amount of damage along with having his heart attack before this fight. And on top of that the technique was still technically being overpowered by Wakataki's strikes, though it could have been argued that had he not received this much damage, he could have withstood these strikes with this technique. Now we get onto the strikes of the Adamantine kata. Most of them are just essentially basic strikes that can be used in the Adamantine kata, as each strike is essentially greatly enhanced. And to give you an example as to how hard Ohma could hit with the Iron Breaker, this is his strikes essentially before the Iron Breaker, and this is what a strike looks like when he's able to use the Iron Breaker to enhance his strikes. Now, if we go off the size comparison of the first crater that Ohma made, and applying the statement that Wakataki is essentially hitting at 50, that could potentially mean that the Adamantine kata's output in terms of enhancing an opponent's striking strength could potentially be a 5 times boost than what it normally would be, seeing as durability and striking strength they go essentially hand in hand. And the Iron Breaker technique can be used in various different ways, as we have the basic Iron Breaker, which again can be used for each and every strike used by the user. Another technique from the Adamantine series would be Iron Fingers, which works by tensioning the muscles of the fingers to harden them when pinching an opponent or an object. And by combining the Flame Kata with the Adamantine Kata, you can form the technique Flashing Steel, which seems to be a high-speed strike coming straight at the opponent. And another variant of this technique would be Flashing Steel Smash, which seems to be a very hard uppercut moving at high speeds. And another variant of Flashing Steel would be Flashing Steel Pierce, which seems to use the spear hand technique in tandem with the Adamantine and the Flame Katas to move at high speeds in order to potentially pierce an opponent. And another technique, which should be the final technique of the Flashing Steel, would be Flashing Steel Smash, which seems to be a very hard-hitting version of the Flashing Steel. And seems I was wrong, the final technique would be Flashing Steel Blast, which seems to be the hardest hitting version, as it takes advantage of an opponent essentially moving in while also matching I believe their opponent's speed in order to take advantage, essentially doubling the damage output to an opponent. Now, one of the more devastating moves of the Adamantine series would be Iron Breaker Revolution, which is the Adamantine kata used in tandem with the Water kata. Another variant that can be used with the Flame kata would be Flickering Flame, which allows the user to make sharp, sudden turns by manipulating their center of gravity. And now we get on to the final technique, which is Flowing Edge, a defensive parrying technique that has been stated to potentially allow the user to even redirect bullets if used properly. Now, the final kata that we can and will be discussing is the Flame kata. The Flame kata, as previously mentioned, mainly focuses on movement and to increase the overall speed and agility of the user. The very first technique that we see would be Fire Flash, a kind of after image based technique that seems to enhance the user's speed. Now, when we do see Ohma use this technique, he's apparently able to make up to at most 5 after images with this technique, and able to simultaneously strike an opponent, at least in the manga that is. Now, as mentioned before, when used in tandem with the Adamantine kata, he's able to form Flashing Steel, and he can use the variants Flashing Steel Smash, Flashing Steel Pierce, and Flashing Steel Blast. Another technique that he can use in tandem with the Flame Kata would be the Redirection Kata, which allows him to use Flickering Flame, another high-speed technique that allows him to essentially adjust his movement speed when making sharp and sudden turns while maintaining his high speed. Another variant of this would be the Adamantine Kata, Flickering Flame, which again allows him to make sharp and quicker sudden turns while maintaining speed. A high-speed blitzing technique would be Raging Fire, which is a technique meant to blitz, or in this case, outspeed an opponent. Another technique would be Phantom Pace, which is a technique that allows the user to dodge at the last moment, allowing the opponent to believe that they've actually attacked their opponent when in fact hitting just an after image. Now we get onto the last and ultimate technique of the Flame Kata, which is Earth Shrinking. The technique requires the user to essentially be standing, only using their bones and essentially adjusting their center of gravity, allowing for the distance between the user and an opponent to essentially shrink, and giving off the illusion again that the distance between them has shrunk due to how fast that the user moves into their opponent's space. Now that we've covered all 4 katas of the Niko style, we will now cover essentially the final 2 techniques of the Niko style. First being the Nile kata, which essentially allows the user to essentially have 8 mental battles a day per day, every day, essentially while they're sleeping. As essentially how it's explained is, it's essentially an image-based training with one-on-one, or in this case an out-of-body-like experience. Ohma has essentially been using this technique for 14 years. And essentially thanks to this technique, over the course of 14 years, he's managed to simulate having over 40,000 fights. So that should just be, again, a reminder as to just how skilled he is. But now we get onto the final, and again, in my opinion, the most important technique, which would be Demon's Bane, as it's essentially a cross between all 4 katas being used in unison. And essentially it works by absorbing, say, a powerful strike from an opponent, letting the power flow into your body, and then throwing it back at your opponent combined with your own strength. And essentially it uses the Redirection kata to, again, use that to flow the strength into you. It uses the Watcher kata to go limp. It allows the Flame kata to essentially position yourself, and then obviously, and finally, which would be the Adamantine kata to essentially hit your opponent. But there's a more powerful variant that Ohma has managed to develop, and it's called Demon's Bane X Advance. And if we take into account that the advance can be anywhere between a 2 to a 5 times multiplier, that would mean that the force absorbed by the technique would essentially receive anywhere between a 2 to a 5 times multiplier. But seeing as Ohma has managed to control the output of the advance, it's more than likely a 3 times boost thrown back at his opponent, plus his own force added onto it. So now that we've covered his overall techniques and just, his fighting style, let's cover essentially, in my opinion, how his scaling should be as an opponent based off the opponents that he has fought and defeated, and again should scale too. So even before he had entered the Kengan matches, Ohma was easily able to manhandle the Diva King, And apparently the Diva King himself was stated that there are only a few opponents in the world that could apparently defeat him. Which, if we, again, just take that as it is, that would mean only the top few fighters in the world, or at least Kengan level fighters, would only be able to defeat someone such as the Diva King. Next, Ohma was easily able to defeat Ivar, the Russian fighter, who is an MMA fighter. Yet he was easily able to just manhandle him, no diff. Afterwards, Ohma was able to easily keep up with Lahito, despite the fact that Lahito himself as a fighter was stated to be a very high skilled striker, both offensively and defensively. Yet, Ohma was still easily able to catch the W from him. And even later on, when Ohma had both his sight and his hearing removed, he was able to use the cocktail party effect to listen to the bodily sounds of Medicine Man and easily defeat him that way. Later on, with his fight with the super wrestler Sekabashki, guys, I can't, pronounce names, he was able to defeat him essentially by using his own momentum against him when he attacked, aiming for his windpipe to knock him out. After that, while heavily injured, Ohma was still able to have a little scuffle with a not primed condition Hatsumi, but even though that might not sound impressive, Hatsumi as a character at one point was considered for the 5th Fang, so that should still be very impressive. And at one point, Ohma was even able to catch this off-guard Hatsumi. While in the preliminary matches, Ohma was part of the top 5 fighters who would end up being participants in the Kengan matches. Ohma was then able to have a little brawl with Carla herself being part of the Kurei clan. And even if you're not like a top tier member of the Kurei clan, you're apparently a human who has seemingly evolved for modern day combat. Yet Carla herself, who 1 is stated to be a deviant from her own clan, and 2 is more than likely one of the top fighters, was able to brawl this not as skilled Ohma, yet Ohma was still able to have the advantage against her. Later on in his Kengan matches, Ohma completely overwhelmed Inoba easily, but he did lose the advantage due to Inoba using his hair restricting Ohma's movements. Though it could be argued that he didn't even need to use the advance, but even while using the advance, he was still able to hit and target very precise parts of Inoba's body, such as the heart, the liver, and even the solar plexus, just to give like a few examples. In his mental training, Ohma felt confident that he could take on Morobuchi and Adam in a fight, despite only seeing them fight once. And even when Ohma didn't have all his skills back, he was able to catch a mental projection of his master Niko off guard. Later on, in a sparring match with one of the bodyguards, he was easily able to defeat him. Yet it should be noted that he stated that this bodyguard that he had fought actually would have made it pretty far in the Kengan matches. Even when he was regaining small parts of his skill back, he dramatically improved his overall fighting style to the point that Ohma thought that his body was being controlled even by somebody else. And even this young, I believe, bodyguard was able to tell that this incomplete Ohma would actually potentially scale to a younger Fang in terms of skill, despite the fact that Ohma had not regained his full skills yet. In Ohma's second match, he was easily able to overwhelm Ryan with his skills, though it should be noted this Ryan that he fought was using nothing but brute force the whole time they fought. In spite of this, Ohma was still able to win against this Ryan. Now, something that's part of Ohma's past that should be very relevant to his current self would be when he had one of his sparring matches with his teacher Niko. When he was pushed to the absolute brink, he seems to adapt and improve his senses and becomes more aware of his surroundings. He was even able to do this to the point where he was able to see his master's movements. This should be important, as a not holding back Niko should be comparable and actually be scaled to a younger and less experienced Kuroki, potentially. Ohma would later on, after, surviving his coma, easily defeat one of the students of the evil Niko, who was originally the teacher of the fifth Fang of Matsudo. And he had trained this student of his, implying that this student, again, should be a very highly skilled individual. Yet Ohma was easily able to defeat him. Ohma himself would later go on to fight Cosmo, and Cosmo himself was able to develop a reactive precognition technique in his fight. And with this precog, he was controlling the fight so much so that Ohma was initially unable to properly counter Cosmo. Though due to this, Ohma was able to apparently use his own technique against him, this being the zone technique, and take advantage of Cosmo's innate inaction and aim for that, essentially that unconscious part while his body's going in for an action. Ohma would then be the sparring partner for a serious Hatsumi. Again, this should be very impressive considering the fact that Hatsumi originally was going to be the fifth Fang, yet Ohma was essentially used as a sparring partner to help him warm up. Later on, Ohma would then fight Kiryu and even hold the advantage against him in their fight, despite the fact that Kiryu, again, was trained by the evil Niko, the original teacher of the Fang. But what's most notable about this feat was that when he beat Kiryu, who was skilled enough to defeat his original master with his own martial art at, I believe, the age of 16 or even 14. Later on, his fourth match, Ohma was able to fight Wakatsuki and was able to handle his movements while on the defensive. But what's impressive about this is the fact that he was able to handle him with his skill, despite the fact that Wakatsuki's strength was able to essentially overcome the Niko style. And Wakatsuki himself even had to concede that in order to fight someone like Ohma, you have to throw away your own pride in your strength. Now, the context as to why Ohma, in my opinion, was in the back burner of this fight could be seen as almost trying to conserve as much stamina as possible, meaning that if he were to go on the offensive in this fight could have potentially ended sooner for him, or could have ended very differently. Now, an important comment that we actually hear from Kuroki is his thoughts on Ohma's Demon's Bane, as he states a move like that would be difficult even for someone like him to handle, and Kuroki himself at this point should, at least in the Kengan Asura series, be the most skilled individual. Now, as for Ohma's fifth and final match, he was able to briefly fight Kuroki, but he states that it's a shame that Ohma was not in full health in their fight. This should be very important since 1, Ohma had regained all his memories back and was able to fight at his peak skill, and 2, Kuroki had previously defeated the Fang, yet still acknowledged Ohma as a valid fighter. Ohma, with a controlled advance, was able to overpower Kuroki as well, and was even able to be even with him in an exchange of blows. And at this point, he was able to catch Kuroki off guard at least a few times in their fight. But the most notable thing about the fight with Kuroki would be that Kuroki again acknowledged him as having surpassed Niko in his prime, at least in regards to the redirection kata. And this should still be very impressive considering the fact that a prime Niko could potentially scale to a younger Kuroki. Though in spite of all this, sadly, Ohma would lose against Kuroki, at least not without giving him a critical hit to him. So if anybody's managed to see my previous video, you should all know that I essentially covered the strength, speed, and durability for Ohma, but I didn't really give much of a recap since I had to save it for this part. So if you've seen my previous video, you should understand what I'm going to do now. So for the overall recap for Ohma as a character, first off, going over his strength. After essentially recovering from his fight from Ryan, it can be argued that he got at least 3 times stronger than what he was previously, meaning that Ohma's base strength would be at least at 67.5 tons, or in that city block level. But if we remember the fact that the Indestructible allows Ohma to enhance his striking power to at least 5 times, we could say that he's managed to get his strength up to, at least whenever striking, 337.5 tons, or in that multi-city block ranges. But now if we were to say that Ohma used the advance, or at least a controlled output of the advance, that could now mean that Ohma, with a controlled output of the advance, could hit anywhere between 337.5 or 1,012.5 tons of force, essentially nearing that small town ranges of AP. That would be Ohma's low ball though. So now as for Ohma's mid ball, which I did briefly cover in my previous video, if we assume that Ohma is able to punch with 930 tons of force, and we say that the Indestructible again allows Ohma to hit with a 5 times boost, and that would mean that Ohma overall would technically be able to hit with 4,650 tons of force, definitely now in that small town ranges. But if we want to make this feat even more impressive and say that Ohma decides to use a controlled amount of the advance, giving him again a 3 times boost on top of his already impressive strength, that would mean that now Ohma is hitting with at least 13,950 tons of force, or definitely in that small town to town ranges of AP. Now as for his durability. As previously mentioned, in terms of durability, Ohma should again scale to his physical output, meaning that Ohma's base durability should be in that city block ranges, and with the Indestructible essentially enhancing him. And again, if we stack that on top of the advance, he could again enter his small town ranges, though that would again be for his low ball. Now for his mid ball, if we take into consideration that Ohma's mid ball strength could technically already be at nearing that small town ranges, now we take into the fact that him using the Niko style actually manages to enhance his striking power, that would mean that Ohma's mid-ball durability would now be in that small town to town ranges. But if we say hypothetically that he manages to use a controlled output from the advance, he would now be in that small town to town ranges of durability. Now covering Ohma's speed. Now going over Ohma's speed, he initially was comparable to Mach 3 speeds, but again, after his fight with Ryan, we say that he again recovers from that coma. He should have gotten at least a 3 times boost to his overall stats. He would now be comparable to Mach 9 speeds. But if we say that he was comparable to Kryu in his fight, Kryu in his fight at one point had to use the Fallen Demon in order to boost his speed, and we say take into account that, Kryu had taken considerable amounts of damage. We say he only gets bare minimum a 2 times boost. That would mean that Ohma would now potentially be at Mach 18 speeds, and that would be for his base. But if we say that he again uses a controlled output for the advance, giving him again just another 3 times boost to his overall speed, that would mean Ohma's low ball could be anywhere between Mach 9, Mach 18, and at the highest point Mach 54 speeds, or in that high hypersonic plus speed for his combat and reaction timing. But now let's cover his mid ball. And honestly, it could be argued that if we take that feat of Ryan again being able to catch a strike from Ri, and Ri through has multiple statements that he's apparently comparable to lightning speed, we would then say that Ryan is comparable, or in this case relative, to a lightning strike, and Ohma was able to briefly fight against him. That would mean that for Ohma's mid ball, we could say he's comparable to speeds up to 270,000 miles per hour, or in the high hypersonic plus speeds. Now finally will be his skill and techniques. Now even early on with Ohma's fighting experience, Ohma should be obviously a very skilled and gifted fighter, as he should be a prodigy. And when we go into, say, some of the combat that he's managed to do just with his mental training alone, it could quite honestly be argued he's had at least over 40,000 fights by now. And this would be before he manages to start remembering his true skills. Meaning that even before he, achieves his true skills, he could have easily been a very skilled fighter even before that. But once he truly remembers his skill, he ends up becoming one of the top fighters in the series. At least, in terms of skill. Though once he fully remembers his lost skills, I'd say he's quite honestly in the top 5. I'd even say top 3 fighters in the series at that point. Now, I have a few points to back up my reasoning for this. And one of them being the fact that Kuroki himself acknowledges him and even states he should have surpassed Niko in his prime. And this should be in regards to, the redirection kata, but looking back as to how far he has progressed, Ohma is still taking on some of the most skilled fighters in the series, and at least technically has only ever lost to one, that being Kuroki. Though outside of the match, he's technically lost to the Fang as well. And Ohma was also compared to a younger Fang in terms of skill alone. And that would be thanks to one of the bodyguards. But another important factor in this series is the fact that other characters usually did have a hard time essentially evaluating the level of strength and skill Ohma had. And this was mainly due to the fact that, this was before Ohma had essentially regained his memories, essentially further emphasizing, honestly, just how skilled Ohma is, at least, by the end of the series. And, I'd say one of his strongest habits, at least thanks to his skills, the fact that as a fighter, Ohma does have a tendency to lean on, softer, or in this case, more precise skills that actually do seem to be overlooked when fighting. And a good, way to have a good way that I believe that they have foreshadowed this in a sense would be Ohma originally as a fighter leaned more so on the redirection and flame kata, but later on, upon regaining his mastery over, say, the indestructible and water katas, he proceeds to complete himself overall as a fighter. So I hope you guys enjoyed essentially this recap for Ohma's skill, strength, speed, durability, all that. Please let me guys know what you think down in the comment section. Dislike, unsubscribe. And the next video will officially be the Maximum Tournament Arc Baki versus Kengan Match's Ohma match. Hope you guys enjoy. Peace.